She stood frozen at our mother's funeral, mouth slightly open, eyes locked on the man beside me. The man she had once tried to reach. The man who had forgotten her name before he ever learned mine. Justice, it turns out, doesn't always arrive loud. Sometimes it arrives in a charcoal suit, with his fingers laced through yours, while your sister forgets how to breathe. The heavy, sweet scent of funeral lilies met me before anyone did. I walked into that church with steady hands, a diamond I'd earned myself, and a life my sister never imagined I was capable of building. She saw me first. Her eyes moved the way they always did, quick, calculating. The dress, the man, the ring. And then she stopped, because she recognized him. To understand what happened in that church, I need to take you back 6 years, to a version of me I barely recognize anymore. I was 28. I managed client portfolios at a mid-size investment firm in Hartford. Nothing glamorous, but I was good at it. Good enough that by 26, I'd been promoted twice. I ran 4 miles every morning before sunrise. I wrote every thank you card by hand. I never forgot a birthday. My mother used to say I was the kind of woman who held things together. She meant it as a compliment. I took it as one. Julian proposed on a Saturday in October, on the porch of my parents' house, with the maple trees burning red behind him. He'd asked my father. He'd chosen the ring himself, a modest solitaire that caught the autumn light. I said yes before he finished the question. The engagement party was 2 weeks later. 43 people. White tablecloths in the backyard, string lights between the oak trees. My mother's famous lemon cake on a crystal stand she only brought out for occasions that mattered. Vanessa arrived late. My younger sister had a talent for entrances. She came through the side gate in a dress the color of crimson, too bold, a size too small, something that made even my mother press her lips together. She kissed my cheek, squeezed Julian's arm a beat too long, and said, "You finally locked him down." She laughed. Everyone laughed. I smiled. That was the first time I felt it, a small coldness at the base of my throat, like swallowing something that hadn't quite melted. I told myself it was nothing. Vanessa was like that. She'd always been like that. The rest of the party, she clung to him, refilling his scotch, whispering things into his ear that made him smile in a way I didn't recognize. I kept the beautiful bride face. I kept circling the backyard, thanking people for coming, laughing at the right moments. Near the end of the night, I stepped onto the terrace for air. The French doors behind me were cracked, just enough. I heard her voice before I heard the words. Low, smoky, familiar in a way that turned my stomach. "You don't really want her, Julian. You just feel obligated because you've gone this far." I didn't hear his reply. I didn't want to. I stood there with one hand on the iron railing and the October air cold on my face, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not break, shift. The way tectonic plates move. Slow, deep, irreversible. I walked back inside. I found my mother and told her the lemon cake was perfect. I found Julian and put my hand in his. I smiled until the last guest left, and when I got to my car, I sat with both hands on the wheel and didn't move for a long time. I knew. And knowing, I said nothing. 3 months later, I came home early on a Wednesday. There's a specific quality to silence that tells you something is wrong before your brain catches up. The apartment was too still. Julian's good shoes were by the door, the ones he only wore when he was trying to impress someone. Next to them, a pair of heels I recognized. Cream leather, gold buckle, size 7. Vanessa wore a size 7. My hand was on the bedroom door handle before I'd made a conscious decision to walk there. I stood there for 11 seconds. I know because I counted. My heartbeat was loud enough to hear in my teeth, a dull thud behind my molars that tasted like copper. Through the door, I heard Vanessa laugh. That same laugh from the engagement party. Warm, musical. The kind of laugh that made everyone feel included, except me. I set my keys on the hallway table, quietly, the way you set things down when you're trying not to shatter. I walked back to my car. I drove to the parking lot of a CVS on Maple Avenue and sat there for 47 minutes with the engine running and my hands at 10 and 2. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I didn't scream into the steering wheel the way they do in movies. I just sat. I'd heard her voice on the terrace 3 months ago. I'd told myself it was the wine, that I was imagining things, that my sister was many things, but not this. The size 7 heels said otherwise. I drove home. Julian was making pasta. He kissed my forehead and asked how my day was. Fine, I said. The word tasted like chalk. I didn't confront him that night. Not the week after. Not the following Sunday, when Vanessa came for dinner and sat across from me and talked about a listing she'd just closed, her voice bright and untouched, as if she hadn't been in my bedroom 4 days ago. I watched her pass the bread to Julian. Their fingers brushed. Neither of them flinched. My mother noticed nothing. Or maybe she did. And noticing and choosing to look away are the same skill, perfected over decades. I sat at that table with my napkin folded in my lap, and I understood something I think I'd always known, but never allowed myself to say out loud. They were never going to choose me. Not because they didn't love me, but because choosing me would mean admitting what Vanessa was. And admitting what Vanessa was would mean the family portrait, the one my mother had framed above the mantelpiece, all 4 of us in matching cream sweaters, would have to come down. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I helped clear the dishes. I kissed my father on the cheek. I told Vanessa her blouse was pretty. And when I got to my car, I sat in the driver's seat and placed both hands on the wheel. 10 and 2. The same position as the CVS parking lot. But this time, I wasn't frozen. I was thinking. 2 weeks later, Julian pulled the trigger. Not a conversation, a notification. It's not working, he said, looking past me at the wall. It's better this way. I nodded. I said, okay. One word. Because I had known this was coming since the engagement party. Since a voice through a cracked door told me the truth I hadn't wanted to hear. I had been waiting for 3 months, and now the waiting was over. 72 hours after that, a mutual friend sent me a screenshot. It was them, my fiancé and my sister, on a yacht in Santorini, kissing against the sunset. The light behind them was golden and obscene, as if the world had been designed to humiliate me. I stared at that photo for a long time. Then I put down my phone and packed. One trunk. My grandmother's old steamer trunk with brass latches that stuck in cold weather. I put in what mattered. My laptop, 3 months of bank statements, my running shoes, a photograph of my mother holding me as an infant, back when I was the only child, back when her arms didn't have to divide. I left the ring on the kitchen counter next to a note. 9 words. I know, I'm not angry, but I'm done. I drove 5 states south in 14 hours. I stopped once for gas in Virginia, once for coffee in North Carolina. I didn't cry until Savannah, and even then it was brief. 2 minutes at a rest stop, hands still on the wheel. 10 and 2. When I was finished, I kept driving. Stay with me here. Because what happened over the next 6 years is the part that changes everything. I landed in a coastal town where the air tasted like salt and no one knew my name. A studio apartment above a laundromat on Oleander Street, 400 square feet, a window that faced east, the sound of dryers tumbling beneath me at all hours, a low hum I learned to mistake for company. I slept on an air mattress for the first 3 weeks. I ate rice and beans. I ran every morning at 5:15, the same time as always, but now the route was along the water. The ocean didn't care who I was or who I'd been. It just kept coming back. People think starting over is romantic. It's not. It's Tuesday nights eating cereal at a folding table. It's Saturdays when your phone doesn't ring because no one in the new city knows your name. It's standing in the shower at 11 p.m., wondering if you made the biggest mistake of your life. But here's what no one tells you about rock bottom: the acoustics are extraordinary. When everything is quiet, you can finally hear yourself think. I got a job at a small art gallery on the waterfront. Front desk, $12 an hour. The owner was a woman named Margaret, who was 73 and wore turquoise rings on every finger. She didn't ask about my past. She asked if I could organize a filing system that hadn't been touched since 1997. I could. That was enough. I started therapy. I journaled until my hand cramped. I ran longer. I worked harder. Margaret promoted me within 6 months, not out of pity, but because I'd reorganized her entire inventory, digitized 12 years of records, and brought in 3 artists she'd never heard of. By the end of my second year, I was running the gallery's accounts. I opened a savings account at a credit union 2 blocks from the waterfront. Every month I transferred what I could. Some months $400, some months $1,200. I never touched it, never even looked at the balance. After 4 years, it held $29,500. I wasn't building a weapon. I was building a floor, the kind no one could pull out from under me, because I'd poured every inch of it myself. Liam walked into the gallery on a Wednesday in April of my 4th year. He wasn't looking for art. He was looking for a birthday gift for his mother. Something that makes you feel something without telling you what to feel. His words, not mine. He was an architect. He designed houses, specifically the kind of houses that were built to last. He said the most important part of any structure wasn't the walls or the roof. It was the foundation. Everything else is decoration, he said. The foundation is the promise. He came back the following Wednesday, and the one after that. The third time, he didn't pretend to browse. I think I've run out of excuses to come here, he said. Would you like to get coffee? I said yes. We talked about impressionism and purpose and the sound the ocean makes before a storm. Not once about money or status. It felt safe in a way I'd forgotten was possible. I told him about Julian 8 months in, sitting on his porch with wine we couldn't really afford, the ocean filling the spaces between sentences. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You didn't just leave them. You built this." He gestured at the house, the porch, the water. That's not running away. That's architecture. The ring came 2 years later. He designed it himself, sketched 11 times before he was satisfied. Every angle intentional. Not modest like Julian's solitaire. Not extravagant. Precise. Like the foundation of a house that would stand. I said yes before he finished the question. What I didn't know, what neither of us knew, was that Liam and Vanessa had already crossed paths. 2 years before I left Connecticut, Liam's firm had been commissioned for a waterfront development project. The launch event brought together architects, investors, and real estate agents from across the state. Vanessa had been there, working the room the way she always worked rooms: warm, deliberate, strategic. She'd introduced herself to Liam. She'd laughed at something he said. She'd handed him her card and suggested they meet for coffee. He'd been polite. He'd pocketed the card the way you pocket things you know you'll never use. He'd never called. She'd never forgotten. And now, 6 years later, this man, this quiet, deliberate man who hadn't found her worth a phone call, was standing in a church doorway holding my hand. While I was building that floor, dollar by dollar, the story Vanessa had been telling everyone back home was falling apart. She'd told people I'd had a breakdown, that I was unstable, that I'd come around eventually. It was a clean narrative, the kind that worked as long as no one could check it against reality. Then a mutual friend found my gallery's website. My name on the About page. Curator. A photograph of me standing in front of a collection I'd built myself. Coastal landscapes, muted colors, light through sea glass. She sent the link to 2 people, Those two people sent it to 4. Vanessa heard about it at a brunch. My father told me later that her face went blank. Not shocked, not angry. Blank. The way a screen looks when the system crashes and hasn't decided whether to reboot or shut down entirely. She excused herself, went to the bathroom, didn't come out for 12 minutes. When she did, she smiled and asked who wanted more mimosas. But my father said her hands were shaking. A few months after the website, Liam's firm was invited to present at a regional architecture award ceremony. I went as his guest. I didn't know Vanessa would be there. She'd come with a real estate contact, someone with ties to coastal development, the same circuit Liam's work moved in. She saw me from across the room before I saw her. I was talking to Margaret, who'd come as my guest, who was telling a story about a painting she'd sold in 1986 to a man who cried when he saw it. I was laughing, a real laugh, the kind that comes from a place that doesn't hurt anymore. Vanessa crossed the room toward Liam. I watched from 10 feet away, mid-sentence with Margaret. She extended her hand. She smiled. That same smile from the engagement party. Warm. Practiced. The smile that had always worked on everyone. Liam shook her hand the way you shake hands with someone at a function. Present, polite, already thinking about something else. He said it was nice to meet her. He did not say her name. He did not remember it. Then he excused himself, crossed the room, and put his arm around my waist. He had no idea what he'd just done. But Vanessa did. I caught her eye across the room. Just for a second. She was standing near the bar, alone, her champagne untouched. I didn't walk over. I didn't say anything. I turned back to Margaret and let her finish her story. Some things don't need to be said. They just need to be witnessed. The invitations back home had been slowing for a year by then. The Christmas party Vanessa had hosted for 3 years went to someone else. The book club stopped including her. Not officially, just quietly. The group chat went still every time she posted. The brunches shrank from 8 to 5 to 3. Rachel, my old best friend, ran into her at the grocery store. She said hello without stopping. 3 words. Keep walking. That's not confrontation. That's a community doing the math on its own. The morning of my mother's funeral, I dressed in black and stood in front of the mirror with Liam behind me, his hands resting on my shoulders. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," I said. And I was. When we walked into that church, his hand holding mine, my ring catching the stained glass, reds and blues and golds, all eyes turned. But Vanessa's? Hers went still. She saw the dress. She saw the ring. She saw him. Not the him she'd imagined, the vague, upgraded version of what Claire had moved on to, but him. Specifically him. The man from the waterfront event who'd pocketed her card and never called. The man from the award ceremony who'd shaken her hand without remembering her name. This man was my husband. The irony didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It arrived the way the worst things do. Quietly, and then all at once. She tried to recover. I watched her do it. The slight lift of the chin, the practiced neutral expression. But her jaw was tight. Her hands wouldn't stay still. During the service, the pastor spoke about grace, about forgiveness, about the things we leave behind. I watched my mother's hands, folded, still, resting on satin in a casket that smelled like gardenias and furniture polish. Those hands had arranged flowers in the kitchen, had hovered over a white hydrangea the afternoon I told her the truth, had reached for a wine glass instead of reaching for me. After the service, family members found each other in the low murmur of reunion. I heard it in the corners of the room. "She's doing well. That's her husband. She looks incredible." Vanessa heard it too. I watched the flicker pass across her face. Once, then gone. The practiced absorption of a woman who'd spent years swallowing things she couldn't say out loud. She tried to redirect the room. A comment here, a remark there, pointed enough to land, vague enough to deny, passive aggression dressed as small talk. Liam didn't rise to any of it. Once, just once, she aimed something in my direction. He looked at her with an expression that wasn't cold, wasn't sharp, just completely still, and said a single quiet sentence I didn't catch. She didn't try again. I watched her unravel by degree, the over-explaining, the hair adjusting, the desperate recalibrations of a woman who had always controlled rooms and was finding that this one no longer tuned to her frequency. Near the end, she cornered me, almost desperate for some scene, some confrontation, something she could use to reclaim a narrative she'd been losing for 6 years. I looked at her. She was still beautiful, still polished, still Vanessa. And I felt, in that moment, nothing I hadn't already made peace with. I said softly, "You can keep the memories. I made new ones." That was all. Her face changed in a way I'd never seen before. Not anger, not deflection. Something quieter and harder to name. The expression of a person who has just understood something they cannot take back. She had no reply. I walked away. My father found me in the vestibule before we left. He looked older, not by years, but by weight. The kind of aging that happens when you spend a decade choosing peace over truth, and the bill finally comes due. He handed me an envelope. "She wrote this," he said, 3 months before she passed. "She asked me to give it to you here. Not before, not after." His voice cracked on the last word. He walked away before I could respond. The envelope was cream-colored, my name in her handwriting, steady, careful, slightly tilted to the right. The kind of handwriting that belongs to someone who believes presentation matters. I opened it standing in that vestibule, with Liam waiting by the door and Vanessa somewhere behind me in a pew she hadn't left. "Claire, I knew. I knew the day you told me, and I knew before that. I knew when Vanessa started wearing a perfume she couldn't afford. I knew when Julian stopped meeting my eyes at dinner. I knew the way mothers know, not because someone tells them, but because the silence in a room changes shape when something has gone wrong. I picked up my wine glass that afternoon because I didn't know how to pick up the truth. It was too heavy. It would have meant looking at your sister and seeing something I'd spent her whole life refusing to see. It would have meant admitting that the daughter I'd protected, excused, and championed was capable of cruelty I couldn't fix with a phone call or a dinner invitation. So I chose the glass. I chose it again when I called you at Christmas and asked you to come home for the wedding. I heard your voice, steady, kind, saying you hoped she was happy. And I knew I was talking to the strongest person in our family. And I was asking her to be small again, so the rest of us could stay comfortable. I am sorry, Claire. Not the kind of sorry that asks for forgiveness. The kind that sits with what it did and doesn't look away. You built something I never could. A life that doesn't need anyone's permission to exist. I see that now. I see it the way I should have seen it 6 years ago, standing in my kitchen with hydrangeas and Joni Mitchell, when my daughter told me the truth, and I reached for a glass of wine instead of reaching for her. I love you. I loved you then. I just didn't love you well enough. Mom. I folded the letter along its original creases. I didn't cry, not because I was holding it in, but because the tears I might have cried 6 years ago had already been spent. In a CVS parking lot, on a kitchen floor, at a rest stop in Savannah. Used up, little by little, in all the private places where no one could see them. What I felt now was different, quieter, like setting down something you've been carrying for so long that your arms have forgotten they're tired. She saw me, even if it was written on paper instead of spoken across a kitchen counter. Even if it was too late, she saw me. I put the letter in my coat pocket and walked out of the church. Liam was standing by the car. He didn't ask what was in the envelope. He didn't need to. He just opened the passenger door the way he always did, without ceremony, without performance. Just there. I paused at the top of the church steps. The October air was cool on my face. The maple trees were burning red again, the same color as the day Julian proposed, the same color as a life I'd chosen to leave behind. But now the red didn't mean what it used to mean. Now it was just autumn, just leaves doing what leaves do. I didn't look back. I walked down the steps, crossed the parking lot, and got into the car. Liam turned the key. "Home?" he said. "Home," I said. Looking back, I learned two things. The first is that silence has two faces. There's the silence of people who look away because the truth is inconvenient. The wine glass, the dinner table, the room where everyone performs normalcy and no one says the thing that needs to be said. And there's the silence of someone who has decided to stop explaining herself to people who were never listening. One is cowardice. The other is architecture. The second is that you cannot steal a life that someone is willing to rebuild. Vanessa took my fiancé, my family's loyalty, my place at the table. She took everything I had, but she couldn't take what I was. The woman who ran 4 miles before sunrise, who drove 5 states south with a trunk and 9 words, who built 29,500 in a credit union no one knew about. That woman was never in the ring on Julian's counter. She was in the driver's seat. She was building a floor. Vanessa stole a house. I kept the foundation. So let me ask you something. I never confronted Vanessa. Not until that one quiet sentence at the end of a funeral. I never raised my voice. I never said, "You took him from me." I just left. And I built something she couldn't stop staring at. Some people would say that's strength. That walking away quietly is the bravest thing a person can do. Others would say I owed it to myself to look her in the eye and say everything, out loud, without softening a single word. I genuinely don't know which side I'm on. Some mornings I wake up certain I did the right thing. Other mornings I wonder, what would you have done? You know what I keep coming back to? That night in the CVS parking lot. 47 minutes with the engine running and my hands at 10 and 2. I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning. Not the cream heels by the door. The heels were just information. The beginning was the moment I chose to sit with what I knew instead of shatter from it. Every quiet decision after that was a brick. And I didn't know I was building anything. I just knew I was done knocking on a door that would never open. So I stopped knocking, and I started building. That's not revenge. That's architecture. And maybe you know what that feels like. Maybe not the sister, maybe not the fiancé, but the table where no one chose you. The phone call where someone asked you to be small so everyone else could stay comfortable. The moment you understood that the people who were supposed to protect you had decided protecting you was too expensive. If you're sitting in your own parking lot right now, hands at 10 and 2, engine running, not sure whether to drive or stay, I want you to know something. The fact that you haven't shattered yet, that's not weakness. That's the foundation. If Claire's story stayed with you, if you're still thinking about that letter, or the terrace, or the 9 words on a kitchen counter, I'd love to hear from you. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. If you're new here, I tell stories like this every week. Stories about women who chose silence over spectacle, and won. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. One last thing. There's a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't slam doors or raise its voice or post a manifesto. It just wakes up early, runs 4 miles, saves what it can, sits for 47 minutes in a parking lot and decides, quietly, without witnesses, that it is not done yet. It builds, brick by quiet brick, until the life it's built becomes the thing the people who tried to break it cannot stop looking at. That's quiet power. And it doesn't need anyone's permission. Until next time.